The views and opinions that are expressed in this and future podcasts are not the views coming out of the State Office of African American Affairs and are not the views coming out of any other state agency, including the governor's office.
I'm Danny Golden.
And I'm Devin Williams.
And this is Re-Educated, a podcast brought to you by the New Mexico State Office of African American Affairs. Welcome, everybody, to Re-Educated, a podcast where we're going to rethink, relearn, and get re-educated on many topics concerning the Black community here in the state of New Mexico.
The purpose of the podcast is to educate the community on environmental, social, and physical inequities and challenges that Black communities must deal with, and what can be done to empower the Black community to help them navigate through the understanding of legislation and policy on a micro and macro level.
Welcome to our second episode of Re-Educated, a podcast where we're going to rethink, relearn, and get re-educated on many topics facing our Black community here in the state of New Mexico. This one's going to be a bit heavy, so we want to first start off, before we even get into it, by acknowledging that some of the information and the conversations we're going to be having may be triggering to some folks. Take care of yourself. This is a space for learning, growing, and for creating the change that we want to see. But we know that it's important to acknowledge the mental health of our audience, of ourselves. We don't take this lightly at all. And we encourage you to step away if you need to, take a break. These are some very heavy topics and some very heavy information, but we feel that it's necessary for us to have these conversations. So we hope you'll join us, and here we go. So this episode is going to be focused on law enforcement, and it's a very timely episode because of everything that's happening in the world. Recently, we lost a beautiful human being, Breonna Taylor, who was a 26-year-old Black woman that was gunned down by officers in her home in the middle of the night as she slept, and the officers executed a no-knock warrant. The whole country, the whole world, I would even say, is grappling with this right now. When especially you see something as tragic as this take place, and there's been no justice for Breonna Taylor and many others, it leaves us feeling lost, in pain, questioning, confused. Why don't our lives matter is the question that so many of us are asking. Yesterday, the verdict came down that none of the officers would be charged in the death of Breonna Taylor. They would only one of them would be charged with wanton endangerment. Wanton endangerment is a Class D felony, which means that it is the least serious of any felony that you can be charged with. And basically, this person will be charged with the bullets that missed Breonna Taylor. This is heavy. As Black folk and as allies, I think the question that so many of us are asking is, how many of us is it going to take to be gunned down, to be beaten, to be killed before we see some really, really big systematic changes that prevent these tragedies from happening? How are you feeling, Devin? I mean, it's hard. We're in mourning.
For me, I'm still trying to process and piece together, how is it so difficult for the people that we lose to get justice?
Right.
How hard is it just to provide the proper way to go about this situation? I just don't understand how you have an individual, a young Black woman, killed in her sleep, and the cops that killed her, the no-knock warrant that was executed, all those things coming into place, and you just charge an individual for the wall.
Right. The bullets that went in the wall. That was
damaged.
Right.
I just don't understand where the correlation is between an individual getting killed and the only justice that is given is to a wall or to a piece of property.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically telling me that Black people, Black women are no more than the property that they reside in.
Yeah. It's devastating, right? Because on a day-to-day, we see these messages, right, about us and who we are and all of the ways that they try to portray us in the media and entertainment and things like this. You know, in the news, we're overrepresented as criminals, as thugs, drug dealers. It sucks, but we're kind of used to it because we see it. But I think with a situation like this, it's just such a blatant message. It's such a clear message that law enforcement can act in these situations. And yes, I get it. I get it. These are tough situations sometimes. But in this case, it wasn't a dangerous situation. You had a couple in their home sleeping, and it came out that they found a witness who said that these officers announced themselves before they entered, but clearly the people who were actually occupying the apartment didn't hear. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it wasn't that way for them. That wasn't their reality. And nevertheless, now you have a woman who is gone, who's been ripped away from us, who's been ripped away from her family, from her friends, from her important job. I mean, this woman was a frontline worker. This woman was saving lives during a pandemic. I think the message that it sends so clearly to us, not covertly and sneaky like they do in the media, it was overt that police officers can act in an instant, take a Black life, and not be held accountable for it. This message to us says your Black life doesn't matter. Your Black life isn't enough for us to act. Like the justice system has to dole out justice. And it can't only dole out justice for a certain segment of the population. The justice system should be serving all who are in this country because it's happening now. People are feeling it now, and people want justice now. I think that one is kind of fresh and raw because of their decision not to charge the officers. But we're still grappling with, we just lost George Floyd. We just lost Daniel Prude. We just had Jacob Blake shot in the back 7 times while running away from an officer. And thank goodness he lived to tell about it, because many of us who are in these encounters don't. But he is paralyzed. His life is forever altered, not to mention the lives of the children that watched as their father was shot in the back 7 times. It's a powerful time, right? Because typically when you're exposed to this, what happens? You get desensitized. You start feeling like, this is normal. But we are in a time right now where this is a civil rights movement like we haven't seen since the 50s and the 60s. People are not desensitized. We are angry. We are pained to our core. We are frustrated. We are confused. And we're just looking for answers. And so I think that's what sets the stage for our conversation right now is, first of all, why do these issues exist? How did this come to be? How did this system evolve into such a monster that feeds on the bodies of Black and brown people? And what can we do right now, today? How can we band together as a community? How can we lift our voices and use our whole selves? How can we show up even in the midst of such devastation in order to really, really impact change? And I think that this is kind of a place to start by educating ourselves, getting the facts out there, and talking about where we stand and where we want to be and how to get there.
Since 1912, Loveless Health System has been committed to meeting the growing healthcare needs of the Albuquerque community. They're invested in bringing people, providers, and technology together to ensure patients receive the best care possible. The vision of African American Student Services, AFRO, is to cultivate Black excellence on the university campus through educational discourse, leadership development, holistic health, wellness practice, and community engagement. The African American Student Services program at UNM provides culturally relevant programs designed to assist primarily African American Black students in making a confident transition and successful adjustment to the University of New Mexico.
Next, we're going to hear from Michael Moody, who is an entrepreneur with a background in organizational leadership. He has a plan that he's been taking to legislators for criminal justice reform, and he considers himself not a community activist, but a community advocate.
Community advocate, not an activist. An advocate is somebody that will speak on behalf of the unheard and the unseen, always trying to be a voice for those people instead of being reactive. I like to be proactive. Being involved in police reform and speaking to representatives from various states and trying to figure out a way when we don't have situations where you have a Breonna Taylor.
Yes, and we definitely need individuals like you who are willing to be that voice and speak upon certain issues and challenges that we face as a Black community. What are your thoughts on the situations with police brutality? How do you feel about all these things that's been going on?
My thoughts are two-pronged. There's actually two things that are happening when you see police brutality. And as a military veteran, I can kind of speak to that piece of it, of the two things. But what you're seeing is two individuals suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. What do I mean by that? I went into the military after 9/11, right, in 2005. So during 9/11, the towers go down, and as you go through basic military training, you are preparing, one, to defend your country, and as you go through that training, there's always this, who's the enemy, right? The people of Middle Eastern descent are Muslim, so they're kind of gearing your mind to think like this, right? Once I got out in 2009, I never had any symptoms of being traumatized from being in the military. But as I got out in 2009, I moved to Chandler, Arizona in 2017. And as I would take my daughter to karate, I was a project manager at a Fortune 2 company. So on my team of IT experts, they were of Middle Eastern descent. And I never could understand why my fight or flight would kick in, right? I would never understand, why is this anxiety so high right now? And I thought about it. I was like, this is something that's happening subconsciously. My body is reacting to what I was trained 10 years ago, right? So when you see police officers, they've already been taught and trained that Black people are going to be aggressive when you approach them. Black people have seen us been gunned down on TV. When a police officer approaches a Black male or even female, everybody in that situation is anxious because of PTSD.
Yes.
They've seen what happened, and the victim has seen what happened, so now you're dealing with two anxious individuals, but only one of those individuals has a weapon of mass destruction. So who's going to come out alive? The officer. Right? So I think of it as the psychology of intent. The officer maybe has no intentions of doing that. However, they've been trained and seen on TV what happened. The Black individual that is also being encountered by the police knows historically what happens in these situations. I take the Jacob Blake example. When the police arrived on scene, that young man was running to his car to leave because that was PTSD. He knows how this story ends already. Before the police even get out of the car, he had done nothing wrong at that time. He was breaking up a fight.
Right.
Yes.
But what he's seen on TV, when the police show up, I get shot, and he was right.
Yes. And we definitely, as Black people all have some sense of PTSD even before we're born, because we have the stories of our parents and cousins and family members that just give us a specific image of what it looks like being in interactions with police and law enforcement. Right. What do we do to address the image that law enforcement has associated with Black people?
It's going to take training, much like I talk about, training leaders. Officers need to be educated. Officers need to understand that just because this person is Black doesn't mean he has ill intent for you. We're always taught, make sure you don't make any sudden movements when the police come around, or, make sure you're yes sir, no sir. I myself had a gun pulled on me by the police officer when I was 16 years old. And it's such a regular occurrence that I forgot that it happened.
Yeah.
Wow.
I literally forgot that I had a gun put to the back of my head by a police officer at 16 for no reason.
It's just interesting, really quickly. I heard you say benefit of the doubt. And so often, in these situations, because of what you're talking about, because of the images that are portrayed in the media of us, because of the training that they get sometimes that is, discriminatory and fuels these fears of Black people when they enter these situations, we don't get the benefit of the doubt. I know that just recently there were 2 officers gunned down by a white male in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And if you've seen that video, there's so much time where they gave him the benefit of the doubt. What is it going to take for them to give us the benefit of the doubt in these situations? Is it just the training? Do they need also more strenuous requirements and qualifications for their education?
I feel like it comes from training. It comes from the environment that they're in. When you think about code, the blue line of silence, that ethos means that no matter what happens, I have your back, right, wrong, or indifferent. So that means that you can do no wrong.
It's like a gang.
To go. Like, you can't have a blue line of silence when you're trying to protect the public.
Right.
You take an oath to serve and protect. You're not doing that because you know what's going on and you know that it's wrong.
Before we move forward, why, whenever we have the loss or the attempt of a murder on a Black life, do we always try to blame the victim?
It happens so often, right? When Michael Brown was murdered, what did they do? The first thing, they posted pictures of him looking a certain way. And y'all know what I'm talking about. They didn't post the sweet pictures of him with his family and doing the things that teenager. No, because it's all systematic. Because this system is fed and is fueled by the fear that's propagated in the images that people see. Now they're talking about, oh, well, they weren't an angel. They did this. They did that. Remember, it came into question with Michael Brown, oh, he stole this and he did that. Last time I checked, we were in the United States of America and you're innocent until proven guilty.
Exactly. Like with George Floyd. Oh, he was on drugs. Oh, he was using counterfeit money, drug acts, and being a part of some type of
drug trafficking ring.
Exactly. And it's always an excuse, and it's always something that's saying the victim did this, and so that's why they died. And so essentially, they're just trying to justify why Black people always have to die.
Right.
And there's no justification for the loss of any individual, specifically Black individuals, but any individual.
Right. And here's the thing. I mean, I think something else that's worth mentioning in this conversation is that guilty people don't deserve to die either. Guilty people are not sentenced to execution by Officer Smojo, who shows up on the scene. I'm going to bring law and order. Because that's not law and order. That's, in fact, the antithesis of law and order, right?
Exactly. Who made you judge, jury, and executioner?
Right.
Who gave you that right? Who gave you that power?
they've given themselves the power. And I think that as we see this unfold, we realize that the system is so convoluted and so permeated with practices that have a long history. We got to take it back to the origins. You always got to get back to the root. And, you know, how is it that policing even came about in the first place? The way that it has evolved into now came from policing slaves. Monitoring, controlling, and intimidating Black people. That's what they did. They was just going through, you know, rounding us up. And they, you know, we know it to be a fact that there have been white supremacist gangs that are within many police departments. We know that even if that is a little extreme, so say you're listening and you're like, it's not that extreme, you know, that type thing. Well, we know that their training is, in a way, like biased a lot of times, right?
Yeah. And essentially, the police were rounding up these individuals to become slaves again.
Right.
And that segues into where we are now in a society to where individuals are getting in trouble or being sent to jail and prison over minor charges, over minor offenses, just so they can get Black people back in these different institutions to do the free labor, to provide free or very cheap resources, and to essentially fund these private institutions and these private organizations that couldn't afford to pay individuals regularly.
Right, right. And isn't that funny? Because we talk about the preservation of racist systems through transformation, right? So isn't that so similar that we had this whole group of people that were stolen from a continent to come over here and do labor, right? And so we're not looking at slavery where we're in chains and we have the metal masks on and we're being whipped and, you know, like obviously it's not that. But now we have this permutation of this system where the Black bodies are still commodities just by another name. Now they're prisoners. You know, I would like to, you know, encourage everybody, if you haven't seen the documentary by Ava DuVernay, 13th, you should watch it because it really does do an excellent job. She does a phenomenal job of going back and getting the political and social breakdown of how that transition happened from us being the slave population and that being translated into the new slaves, you know, that are prisoners, because they threw that in there, right?
Oh, yeah.
They was like, dash, I'ma just say, you know, you can be free, but, you know, unless you're a prisoner. So what do you do, right? In that situation, you find ways to make people prisoners. And I think that kind of leads us to the next point is, what are you going to do? You're going to over-police that community that's susceptible, that is, you know, fragile in many ways because they already don't have funding for education. There are food deserts galore. There's a lack of access to healthcare. So you over-police it because they're easy and they're vulnerable.
Yeah, and one of the things that we'll touch on in a later topic, the housing and the marginalization aspect of Black people. Essentially, they pigeonhole Black people into certain communities. They cut off or they restrict resources into those communities, and then they target individuals for living in a impoverished community.
Right.
And along with that, the language that they use to label and brand Black people, as well as the media, the imaging, the messaging that they give to Black people, all that is used to get these individuals and keep Black people in the prison system. Because again, our society cannot function without the exploitation of people, specifically Black people.
That's absolutely true. Who are you going to build on? I mean, if you think about it, that's how this country came to fruition. We had people, you know, European colonizers that came to a country that was not theirs. They raped, pillaged, and destroyed, decimated millions of people, took their land and called it theirs and said, God done told me that this was my destination, manifest destiny. We're supposed to go and we're supposed to do this and we're supposed to do that. And not much has changed, right?
Not at all. And one of the things that we're dealing with now is they did all those things. They built this country off the back of Black and Indigenous people just to say, okay, we're here now. You're lazy. You need to do some work.
Right.
You need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We did that. We got here because of the work and the time and the energy that we put into being successful.
Right.
And not willing to acknowledge the systemic issues, the history, the exploitation of Black people, and essentially look at it as, oh, we're exactly the same. Looking at that colorblind racism and saying, me and you are just people. You can be here if you did exactly what I did, or if you worked as hard as I worked to get here. And essentially, when you look at colorblind racism, that's just giving them an excuse not to look within themselves and not to acknowledge the consciousness of white people looking at this Eurocentric structure. And you do all of those things and you're not willing to acknowledge that, again, Black people, we built this country and we're still trying to navigate this, even though, like I said, it been exploited, had our ideas taken and profited off of.
Our culture,
Our culture. We have certain cultures, certain things, and specifically with Black women, there's a richness in the culture that we present. And
they love Black culture, but they don't love Black people.
Exactly. And when a Black woman expresses her culture, she gets antagonized for it. But when a white person does it, it gets a lot of praise.
It's chic.
Exactly.
It's high fashion. It's avant-garde, But it's not, because we're not a costume to be worn. And we're not an ornament to your very myopic, Eurocentric life. We talked about colorblind racism, and I kind of want to touch on that really quickly, because you might say, oh, well, like, what do you mean by that? I've never heard that. So you can recognize this colorblind racism when you hear people say, I don't care if they're black, brown, yellow, purple. Fam, there's no purple people. Like, yet, I mean, we haven't traveled to the other places in space, and I'm convinced that there might be purple people other places. But here, we ain't got purple people.
Exactly.
We got Black folk, we got white folk, we got Latin folk, we got Asian folk, we got Middle East. You know what I mean? And so by saying, I don't see color, that's one of those common phrases that people hear, I don't see color, right? But that is taking away from all the richness that each person from each different culture has to offer. And therefore, if you don't see the value in what they have to offer, do you see the value of them at all? And now we're here and we've seen the evolution where we went from, slavery. Other people got a 200-year head start.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Like, we started way behind the curve. And we're still trying to catch up. But what happens is the system just goes in undercover and then re-emerges and rears its ugly head in different ways. And that's when we have the evolution of language. So now we're not going to use the N-word to refer to you. We're going to call you a minority.
A person of color.
First it went to Negro, right?
Yeah.
The Negroes or coloreds, and then it evolves into, we see the language evolve into at risk. Minority. We see the language that we refer to as dog whistle politics. The war on drugs and we got to be tough on crime, and that whole Nixon-Reagan era where they really perfected the craft of convincing white people that Black people and their drugs and their crime was an imminent and dangerous threat to the average white family. And you see policies then being passed and conversations being had that are like, some people are like, oh, this is just a regular political conversation. It's just normal political rhetoric, but it's not.
Yes.
It's not normal to reform these Jim Crow laws and reform them into what we see now, which is, like you said, the lack of resources put into housing, into health, the over-policing of our neighborhoods. If you go to a predominantly Black neighborhood, what are you going to see? You're going to see a large presence of police officers, but you don't see a large presence of Whole Foods. I'll tell you what you don't see. You don't see a large presence of, resources and beautiful schools with big gyms and theaters.
And along with that, you don't see Black police officers. You don't see police officers that look exactly like you, that can relate to the experiences that you've been a part of because you're Black.
Yeah. And I think that that's important because we want to see ourselves, right, in the authority and the people that are charged with serving and protecting us. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that, while more of us having a more diverse force would surely impact us. If the system is broken, just because you're a Black person in it doesn't mean that you're not susceptible to the tomfoolery and the
influence
of the pervasive white supremacy in that establishment that's been present from the very beginning, from the genesis of that organization. So then we have, fast forward to today, we're going through this pandemic. And I'm not talking about COVID because we know what's up with COVID.
Yes.
We got plenty. You can turn on CNN. They'll run it all day long, tell you what's up with COVID. Cool. That is very serious. But the other pandemic that we're dealing with that is just as serious and has been along much longer than COVID-19 is the racism. And we're talking about what's happening with our people being gunned down by law enforcement, and then it's being diverted into other conversations. Well, what about Black on Black crime?
Yeah, and the thing about Black on Black crime, one thing you got to look at is proximity. You're essentially going to commit crime to the people that you're closest in proximity with. And so people that are in your neighborhood or people that are next to you. And so essentially when you're looking at Black on Black crime, because you have a predominantly Black neighborhood, essentially you're going to commit crime on Black people. And so you also have white on white crime. You have, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
it's not like a thing like that.
It's not.
Yeah.
And there's no such thing as, Black people targeting Black people just because they're Black. No, it's all about, them being close to one
That's
another.
who they're around.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Just like the white people that kill other white people are around white people.
Exactly.
I don't know, a more stripped down way to put that. But I think that that's really, so on top of being deeply problematic and hurtful and racist, it is unproductive. You know what I mean? Let's have a productive conversation. Okay, yeah, we can talk about Black on Black crime if, you want to call it that or whatever.
Yeah.
And we will need to at that time acknowledge why that even exists in the first place. But right now we're talking about the epidemic of Black people being subjected to violence and to murder and to brutalization at a higher rate. So this doesn't mean that more people, just straight out numbers and per capita, are killed by police officers, because I think that's something else that people try and throw in there. President Trump has said, white people are being killed too. Absolutely they are, because there's a problem with the system, but we're disproportionately impacted.
And the thing is, when you look at Black people being targeted by law enforcement, it's more present in the media. Every time you turn the channel, every time you look at the news, you see another Black person either getting killed, going to jail, or has a case that they're trying to fight or put against them just because they're Black. And so even if, for instance, Black and white people were killed at the exact same rate, again, we're disproportionately affected because there's a higher presence of Black people being targeted by law enforcement than there is white people.
Absolutely. And they're not just targeting adults, they're targeting our children. We see that in the overrepresentation of students who have disciplinary action taken against them in our school systems. I think, don't quote me on this, but Black children are more likely to be, I won't say any numbers, Black children, as a fact, are more likely to be suspended, written up, served detention. They just face harsher consequences committing the same, violations that their white counterparts do.
And I think part of that, again, goes into the language, branding, and imagery of Black children. People tend to view Black kids as adults. And so you have a 12, 13-year-old who's trying to figure out the world, who hasn't grown into themselves, and you're calling them, let's work with this young man. Or you have a young lady, a little girl who has been forced to perform above and beyond just because of the situation with being a Black woman or Black, see, there I go, being a Black girl, but, they label them as a Black woman. And because she's so expressive, so passionate, and there's all these different emotions, these feelings that go into being an individual, especially growing up Black.
The trauma grows you.
People consider her as a Black woman and hold her to a certain standard as opposed to their white counterparts. They're more encompassing of flaws or, certain mishaps that happen in their lives versus with Black children, because that's what they see. That's the language, that's the rhetoric that's been created because, again, Black children, Black boys and Black girls have to go above and beyond just to be at the same level as white children.
Yeah. It's crazy because it's like you're saying young man or young woman, that's a child.
Exactly.
That's a baby that you're talking about. That's not a young woman. It brings to mind 15-year-old Grace. We know her as Grace. We don't know her, all of her other information, but a young Black girl, because that's what she is, 15, who through the pandemic, obviously a lot of our students are doing distance learning or online learning, and she got into some trouble as far as with her mom. There was some background there, but that was addressed. And then moving forward, she didn't complete her homework. And this girl was jailed, and she's 15. If that doesn't speak volumes to you about the burden that society places on children who are Black, I don't know what does. Because when you strip these children of their childhood and their innocence, what do we have? Now we do have people that are traumatized. The course of their lives are impacted forever, and they'll never be the same after something like that. Poor Grace.
And when you look at these things, the effect that you have on a Black child being, having their focus centered around them and them being treated as adults is twofold. One, you obviously are, stripping that child of certain experiences and an opportunity to, again, grow into themselves because they don't know who they are, how they're going to operate within the world. And so you're taking away that at an early age. But number two, you're providing and incentivizing a certain mindset for white children, saying that, oh, you can get away with these things, or you can operate in this way and be okay if there's more attention on a Black person. And so now these white kids are growing up with a certain systemic racial complex, saying, I can do what I want, or I can get away with more things because the highlight is on Black people or the spotlight is on Black people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's wrong. Point blank. I mean, I think that we can all agree upon that. I would hope. I guess we're here because we can't all agree upon it, and that's the sad part. But that brings us kind of to the next saga in this, circle, this cycle, this craziness. Why are they criminalizing the children? Okay, we know that there is this primitive fear that's been instilled. If you even take it back to looking at films that were very prominent at one point in American culture, Birth of a Nation, 1912, really did a great job of painting us as aggressors, painting us as rapists, as violent, as something to be feared,
as unintelligent,
just buffoons. I look at some old stuff and I'm like, wow, like really white people, really white people. And the level that travels and the level that it just seeps in and sticks around.
Yes.
Because that's what, that's where we're at. Like these things happened, these ideas and propaganda were spewed at, white people for certain agendas. And now it's still here.
And it essentially evolves and adapts.
Yeah.
With each opportunity that we have to essentially mobilize, improve the quality of life of Black people, there's another system which is being developed as the original system is crumbling, is being put in place in order to continue to oppress Black people. And with each system that's being created or evolving, it becomes stronger and harder to dismantle because they're creating certain language and certain formalities that they can use in order to keep us, pacified, continue to oppress us, continue to marginalize us.
Continue to really, keep all the pie, not give up any pieces of the pie. And that's really what's disturbing, because the rhetoric and the image of, our country founded on the principles of everyone's free and everyone's created equal. And there's this American dream. And if you just work hard enough, you can get your piece of the pie. But that is not the case. That is not what we experience in this country. We see it. We see that there is a huge wealth gap, a wealth disparity from things like home ownership and education. We're actually quite educated, but I digress. It's broken.
Yes.
The system is so broken for us. It's not broken for the people that built it. It works perfectly. It's a well-oiled machine for them, right? I've heard it said, by many folks lately that we have two justice systems. And I think that I see today, as we sit here and we have this conversation, that's been proven. Because if Breonna Taylor was, Becky Wilkinson, and she was shot in her bed at night, and her boyfriend Brad had her blood all over him and all this stuff, and it was these white people, we would not stand for it. The justice system would have a field day. Yeah. They would have carted them officers in so quick, they wouldn't know what hit them.
They would have lost their jobs and probably had some type of fine or some type of other repercussions that would happen to them.
On top of probably a large payout, right? And obviously there are things like, and it's so funny when it comes to us, like that's when qualified immunity, becomes the thing. Like, these officers are protected because they're in this line of fire and they're serving, and I get all of that. Yes, like it can be a dangerous job sometimes, but when you start merging the ideas as we have done and making criminality synonymous with Black, then the lines are skewed and you can no longer serve justice the way it's supposed to be served.
And why, when it comes to certain situations, especially with Black people, can we not have a bad day? Why can cops wake up on the wrong side of the bed, have all these things happen to them, and then now they're in a position to where they can be aggressive, they can act out, they can release their anger. But when a Black person has a bad day or is going through it or is dealing with a lot of emotional traumas, emotional issues, maybe even having mental health, whatever you want to call it, we have to sit up straight, show our hands, make sure we're not doing anything wrong, can't make any sudden movements.
Do everything perfect.
Exactly.
Right? And we haven't even had the training.
Exactly.
Like these people have been through training, not enough training, which we'll get to.
Yeah.
But they've been through training to remain calm, to de-escalate the situation by this, and this means, to do this and do that. But we're expected to show up fully, 100% on top of things in that situation, even though we know and we see every day and more often now because of the advent of, technology and the advancements of technology, we see it every day that we're, being traumatized. So how is it that we're supposed to remain calm? Is, Michael Moody, one of our guests, talked about how there is a trauma, on both sides. So I really want to kind of point out that, and hear me out, police officers are a victim in a way to the system itself also, because the system is broken. We're not always saying that the people are bad, because there's some individuals who join the police force because they really do want to help. They really do want to, serve and protect.
Yeah.
And you have other people that join for other reasons, and we know that. But when you have a system that doesn't have rigorous standards for education and cultural training and cultural sensitivity training, when you have them not even, they're going to a physical boot camp and a few classes for a year, like what do we expect?
Exactly. And again, we are all victims of this system. We all suffer from the distortedness, all the different broken aspects that the system has to offer. And what makes it hard to really combat this system is that we are all not educated, or we all don't have a holistic understanding of, one, how the system was created, and two, how to navigate or understand or the different dynamics of the system. Black people, we have to know it. We have to know both sides just to survive. We have
code switch.
We have to understand our laws. We have to understand how to navigate, how to fit within the confines of the system. But because the system was created to benefit white people and white culture, they don't have to necessarily look at these certain things. Now, the issue with right now, and a lot of these different big corporations and organizations are advocating for Black people, and not necessarily doing the groundwork or pushing for certain things. You have performatism because, again,
that's the truth.
This country was built on the backs of Black people.
It's still being built on the backs of Black people.
Exactly. And you have all these Black dollars that you still have to tap into. And so essentially, and I might have went on this big tangent and
no,
went
it's okay.
But essentially, they have to figure out how to keep the grace of Black people while sending a message that they don't like Black people or continuously targeting Black people. And so you're just in this balancing act of trying to figure out, how do I stay in oppressor while keeping the oppressed happy?
Absolutely. And I think that brings us to our next, segment when we talk about the systems, right? And how they have come to be. We have to definitely mention it's not just law enforcement and just police officers that are having these interactions, on the ground level. Okay, so that's one layer of the entire system. That's just the tip of the iceberg, right? We have what is called the prison industrial complex. The prison industrial complex is the system of mass incarceration and the multitude of corporations that profit off of mass incarceration. So when you have that layer up there and that kind of trickles down, what do you think is going to happen in these interactions, right? We have it coming at us from all angles. They're being trained. Black people are dangerous. Then they're going into these situations and they're, with all of these preconceived notions about how Black people are and what our place is. Yeah. Really, because they're telling us that our place is in jail. Exactly. Because we're criminals. But and then it fuels this, that's how they fuel. When you have people making money off of Black bodies, not that we're the only ones in prison. Actually, the United States has, I think the largest prison population in the world at this point. It's wild. Yeah. But when you say that, when you make us a commodity, right? Then now the laws are going to be created with the intention of creating commodities and the come up.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like we're a come up for them. Our bodies are a come up for them, because then these corporations get all this free labor. They get, they get all this money, billions and billions and billions of dollars on our bodies, and then they keep us in crazy conditions. We say, oh, they're keeping them like animals. PETA ain't keeping no animals like that. You know what I mean? We not keeping animals like little Scruffy is not my little doggy. Like they're not in, sitting in their own waste and not being clean and not being fed. No, they're being kept in horrid conditions.
And we, even though being in these certain conditions and coming from certain situations, continue to thrive and continue to push and continue to fight. And I think that's one of the most powerful things. And I think that's why a lot of people are afraid of Black people, is because we have that resilience. We have that ability to fight, adapt, push through. And not everybody has that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're a special people. We're a strong people, and we shouldn't have to always fall back on that, right? Like Black people strong, and if we really do the digging, we can understand how that piece kind of contributes to how we're dealt with. Like, oh, you're strong, you can take it, but it shouldn't have to be like that. We shouldn't have to be stronger all the time and stronger for everybody and getting through and fighting every day, because as we know, what does that cause? It causes PTSD. And I think our country, we're dealing with this collective mental health crisis with us, because all of us experience it in some way, shape, or form. Thank goodness all of us aren't losing our lives and all of us aren't being brutalized to the crazy extent that some of us are. But nevertheless, like, it's there. And, I think it's important to talk about how this came to be and all of the aspects, but we do have to address the solutions. And I think that our guest, Michael Moody, I like that he has, a plan with prongs that kind of address law enforcement and reforming it in ways that are meaningful, in ways that really will actually help tailor it to actually serve and protect the people. Yeah,
and I think that when you're looking at solutions, there's a couple of things. There's obviously, when you're looking at the law enforcement and social justice systems, a lot of things that need to be addressed, but a couple of the things that I can think of, one is social or cultural competency. And so understanding the cultures that you're dealing with, understanding the ethnic groups that you're around, being submerged in those communities in a positive way, getting to know those people, because a lot of those people, one, obviously, when you don't look like me, I'm going to be fearful, or not necessarily fearful, but I'm not going to understand you. And being in that position, as well as having the brand that we have as Black people, these law enforcers are going to have a negative connotation and a certain aggression to the way that they treat us, because they don't know us, they haven't been in our communities, and because the brand, they're scared of us. And I think another thing is, again, having our people, and I understand we're victims of the system, but there's something about having an interaction with another Black person, officer or not, that for me, makes me feel better. And just being able to have an interaction or converse, or being in a situation with a Black person, I'm a lot more comfortable, especially with the traumas that I've been through in dealing with law enforcement and what have you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's relatability there that makes you feel comforted in a sense. And so I think that, to your point, it is important to really diversify the force. You know what I mean? Diversify the force, but also diversify the oversight committees, right? Because we talked about having oversight committees that are independent of these forces, because we're going to expect the officers to take their friends to jail to arrest. You know what I mean? Like, it just doesn't work. Like, y'all seen Law and Order. They're all buddy up in there, and rightfully so. Like, you work with people, you go through things, you have, what do you call it when you go through things with someone? Trauma bonding. You know what I mean? Like, That's
Yeah.
with any group, you know what I mean? But you have to have an oversight committee that's separate, that is objective, and that is diverse, and that reflects the community, because all of these bodies, individually are to protect and serve in some way, shape, and form.
Yeah.
So all of them, not just the police officers that are on the ground pulling people over for a broken taillight,
Yeah.
but all the way up to, the upper levels, and the oversight committees have to be diversified, and they have to look like the communities that they're serving. And, we talked about that, diversifying and making the forces reflective of the community. We also talked about training. In my mind, I feel like, let me know I feel like police officers should be lawyers.
Yeah.
You're tasked with enforcing the law. You should know the law, and I should have confidence that you know more about the law than I do.
Yeah.
But I think what the setup says, of how they're trained and everything like that, because we have access to that. All of that's public information, the knowledge and trainings that they get. It says, we don't really have to. We can go and skim over and run some obstacle courses and put on a shiny uniform, and now I'm your boss. Now I'm your master. When I pull you over, you better do what I say, boy, or else there's going to be consequences to pay. You know what I mean? And that's so scary. So, we have to do something about that. Some people are saying too, like, defund the police. We have a guest to talk about what that means, defunding the police and even abolishing the police. But we have some questions, about what that looks like. Kind of on a surface level, I think most people would say that defunding the police looks like diverting, not completely taking everything from law enforcement, because you have a lot of political figures, especially utilizing that mantra as a tool and turning it back on us, right? But you have to divert those resources to other programs that actually help people and that actually are appropriate for the situations, because, like we were talking about earlier, when you have certain situations, you might need a social worker to show up. You might need a housing specialist or a counselor or a person who has extensive training in LGBTQ, dealing with LGBTQ folks. You know what I mean? Like, you need people that are not there to regulate necessarily. They're there to help.
And I think to add on to that, when you're talking about defunding the police and reallocating those dollars and the resources, we need to invest in our children. We need to be a primary care country instead of a tertiary care country, in the sense of we're beating it at the source. We're teaching these kids the proper way to, understand each other's cultures, to have conversations, not to demonize Black kids or not to have certain stereotypes on a certain culture based off of what you see in the media, what your parents have fed you, all these different things. Instead, we're having this system, the school to prison pipeline, to where we're demonizing and referencing Black children as adults, which they're essentially matriculating into these detentions, and they're already getting psychologically trained to be a criminal and be a prisoner in our society. And then once they go to jail, now you're looking at, now we should try to figure out how to reintroduce
them to society.
And essentially that's that tertiary aspect. Instead of getting them as kids and showing them exactly, how to operate, again, how to have those cultural competencies, we're getting them in jail, and now we're giving them a library to look at to change their lives as they're providing free labor for these prisons and these corporations.
It's just backwards. You know what I mean? If you really want to cause division and chaos and dissonance, then flip something on its head and see what happens, right? That's what we've seen. It's just backwards. If we're talking about solutions, that definitely is a place to start, period. I think that a lot of people get turned off when they hear like defund the police, because they're like, oh, our cops aren't going to be safe. They're not going to be this. But what you have to understand is that there's so much money being poured into these police forces and these departments, but look at where we're at. Look at what is happening in our country. There is still crime. There is still like rampant crime, not just black on black crime. There's crime everywhere. You still have that. Now we have this really tumultuous relationship with a whole group of people and the police force that's supposed to serve and protect us. So it's silly to say that you have to pour all this money in order for it to work because, I mean, really, like, is it working the way that it is now with the dollars being poured into it? They say if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's broke.
Yeah.
It is broken. And we really have to look at what we're doing. Money talks, BS walks. The money has to go where it matters. The money has to go where it makes a difference and an impact. And the money has to go to the communities. You know what I mean? It has to go to other sectors that can utilize other methods of help.
Yeah.
For these communities that are being policed, and we actually have something that's been introduced by Mayor Tim Keller, which is the Community Safety Department. It's another like public safety element.
Re-Educated, brought to you by the New Mexico State Office of African American Affairs, aimed to study, identify, and provide change by means of support, advocacy, and resources relevant to the African American community. As a reminder, every voice matters. Make sure you're counted in the 2020 census. The City of Albuquerque Office of Equity and Inclusion aims to inspire and equip city government to make Albuquerque a national role model of racial equity and social justice.
We were able to talk to a local community activist by the name of Nakia Russ, and she's participated in various community events in the movement for Black Lives as of late. She gave us her input on holding public officials accountable.
I think that they do a fabulous job with like playing tug of war where I'm giving you a couple of inches, but I'm taking them back right away. I will be very pleased to see what goes forward. There are things that have been talked about, and so we're going to see how it moves forward and just hold our elected officials accountable.
Absolutely.
From that point on, I think that with George Floyd, I'll just use him, for example, I think he was kind of like a turning point. People are kind of at their wits' end, and there's been continuous protests since. So if our elected officials won't do something, then the people will, and that's when you see the marches. And so we'll see.
And she's right. We will see whether or not these introductions of this new plan from our city level government will be only performative or if we will see them rolled out. But we know that this could be a good thing for our community, right? We're taking money from APD, directly from APD, and we're creating this other department that has those social workers and housing specialists and other professionals show up when people need help. Here's Michael Moody again, the retired Air Force veteran that we heard from earlier, on his plan and what he thinks should happen in order to make the system work for all of us.
Literally just breaking the whole system down. I know a lot of people talk about defund and abolish. I don't think you should abolish, but I think defunding is the right word, and it gets misconstrued because people think defund means like you don't want to pay the police. No. Defund means take away some of the money that you're supplying for ammunition and body armor, and direct that to training. Direct that to having better soft skills. You have an 18, 19-year-old kid coming out of high school. Think about what you were doing at 18 and 19 years old. Were you responsible enough? And people go in the military, and I'm going to tell you honestly, like there's some people that aren't responsible enough to be handling a weapon, period. And the crazy part about it is you're not looking at the 18, 19, 20-year-olds who are doing shooting. These are veteran police officers. It does boil down to training. It does boil down to soft skills. and more rigorous background checks. Like how can you control a community that you don't like? Like if you have these tendencies where you're afraid of black people just because before you even have a badge, when you get a badge, now you feel empowered.
Right.
And that's the truth.
And the dynamic that you described, it seems that it leads to them serving and protecting each other and not serving and protecting us.
Bingo. And just like the Tulsa shooting with the taser, I'm going to tase you, I'm going to tase you.
Mm-hmm.
In Atlanta with Rashard Brooks, Rashard took the taser from the police officer. The police officer shot him because he said he felt threatened for his life. So you can tase a civilian and call it non-lethal. But when the same civilian takes your taser that you consider non-lethal and fires it at you, and now you feel like it's lethal, it doesn't make sense.
It does not make any sense. I haven't heard it put that way. I think we all feel that, but to hear it articulated that, if you use this on me, like you're good with that. Like, it's cool for you to use a taser on me, a civilian, but now I have it just literally because he didn't want to be tased. He's fearing for his life as a civilian, and now he has it, and he becomes a threat to you.
Yes, definitely. And I think that law enforcement and people working in that capacity need to understand what it's like to be in the shoes of the civilian and understand the dynamics of being in a certain encounter to where they see it in the media, they hear it in the stories that their parents and their uncles and their family members tell them, and understand that when you encounter those experiences, when you're put in front of a lethal weapon, the way that you react is not always necessarily going to be calm, cool, and collected because you're fearing for your life. There's so many different perspectives and aspects that go into being in that situation.
Right.
And for them to blatantly just go and react while we have to really process the situation, that definitely needs to be looked at. What is the plan that needs to be put in place to address these systematic inequities?
One for me is body cameras. They never seem to be on or working, right? Those things can be controlled remotely. So from the time an officer gets on shift, somebody remotely should have control over, period. That's easy. That's a simple fix. An outside independent entity, not your supervisor, not the chief of police, somebody that's totally outside the organization should have access to that camera to be able to turn it on. Oversight committees that are independent, diverse, and also transparent. You can't have a thorough investigation if you're investigating your own people. You're just going to find what you want to find and then get rid of what you don't want people to know. The oversight committees do need to be independent and diverse, black, white, men, women, and transparent. Everything that they're investigating needs to be on some sort of website where you, as a citizen, can go to it and see exactly what they're finding. I think social workers do need to be attached, and a lot of times social workers go into these same neighborhoods without weapons, without backup, and are able to either talk people down and then get them the help that they need, rather than sending them to jail. And again, we talked about training, just being culturally competent and understanding how to de-escalate situations. And then implementation of the training.
You're right. There's a lot of different dynamics that need to be observed in order to have an organization that's really for the benefit of the citizens. And so,
of course, we love to highlight and support everything that people are doing in the community and in the movement. And we know that you have a podcast. Would you like to plug that real quick?
Absolutely. So I do have the Expert on Everything podcast. I look at everything from politics to sports to just current events. And I mean, tune in. It's I like to take alternative approaches to things sometimes, but I feel like it's educational. I feel like it's important. Like I tell people, like if you come to like to look at myself as a teacher, as I talked about before. There's a lot of people that have podcasts, like I get it, and everybody has their own niche. But I think this is like a critical moment in our history where we do need to be open to learning. I also have a short film that will be coming out November called What If? Basically, the premise of that film is about what if we had never segregated? An alternative look at that. So.
When there's not a crime being committed, right? We can't have the same people showing up to a bank robbery that we're having show up to a mental health crisis. That just doesn't cut it. It doesn't make sense. And that's why we have Daniel Prude, whose brother called for help for him when he was having a mental health crisis. He called for help. Can you imagine? Like something's going on with my brother or my partner or my friend, someone that I care about, and I call the people, because that's what you're taught. Call 911. We go through all the motions and everything. You call 911 and they show up and they murder your family. They don't help you. They don't help him. They don't ask questions. They don't de-escalate. They don't cover his naked body. They murder him. They lay him down and they apply so much pressure to his body that his body can no longer sustain life. And I'm sorry to be so graphic, sorry, not sorry. Because this is not the time for us to be using euphemisms and trying to be nice, because it's not nice and it's not pretty and it's not okay. So, we have to stand up, like Nakia said it so beautifully. If you think that these things are wrong, say something. Everybody in their own right, we have our social medias, we interact in all kinds of spaces professionally and creatively, and we move through this world and we come in contact with so many different people to where we really do have a voice. And I think, it is really sad when I hear people like, oh, it's not going to make a change. It doesn't matter what I have to say, because that's not true. It's not. We can. It seems hard because we've been dealing with this for hundreds of years in this country, right? It seems impossible, but, we are making headway, and we're really in a time where it's not just Black people, standing up to say that the violence that's being perpetrated against us, we have allies standing up. And that's really what it's going to take, because we did not create this problem. Here's Nakia Russ again on what we can all do individually to show up in this movement.
I think that they do a fabulous job with playing tug of war, where I'm giving you a couple inches, but I'm taking them back right away. I will be very pleased to see what goes forward. There are things that have been talked about, and so we're going to see how it moves forward and just hold our elected officials accountable.
Absolutely.
From that point on, I think that with George Floyd, I'll just use him, for example, I think he was kind of like a turning point. People are kind of at their wits' end, and there's been continuous protests since. So if our elected officials won't do something, then the people will, and that's when you see the marches. And so we'll see.
What would be your advice to people who are still feeling that pain, still going through mourning as we lose more and more of our people every day? What would you say to them about, getting active and doing what they can and holding these public officials accountable?
Wow, just tug on the heartstrings.
I know.
Honestly, the best advice I can say is literally say something. Don't just sit down waiting for the next activist to do something or the next elected official to do something. If you see something, and if you're passionate about the progression of Black people and Black issues and the fact that Black lives do matter, and this blatant act of murder in live time is continuing, if you're against that, then say something. There are things that you can do that may not be necessarily marching. Some people don't feel like they always want to march, or they're not physically capable, but doing something, because we can't make progress if we're not in this together, and it's the only way. And making sure you hold your elected officials accountable, as well as putting people that you choose in office. So vote. A lot of people don't feel that it's important, and who genuinely knows, right? But that is something that you can do. And just staying positive, self-care, taking care of yourself. It's exhausting seeing people that look like you murdered. So making sure you're taking self-care as well, and keep striving.
Yeah.
Keep striving.
Yeah, and I think that we also need to understand that we have to continue to, even though it seems impossible, again, like you said with the verdict in regards to Breonna Taylor, we have to continue to be informed of what's going on legislatively. We have, specifically for New Mexico, a social justice legislation passed or was brought up during the special session this year, and now we have to figure out as a community, how do we get a part of that? How do we continue to look at legislation, look at bills, and pass those things through? How to advocate for a certain legislation, how to be involved as a community in these legislative processes. And that's going to be in part due to understanding where to go. And then when you go to the nmlegis.gov and you're researching bills, you're researching these insight committees and these interim committees and all these different facets that are a part of government and legislation, that's going to be your initial step to helping to systematically create these changes that we need in order to just live in this country.
Yeah. nmlegis.gov. Also, change.org. Change.org does a really excellent job of putting up the actual, like, credible petitions for different causes. That's definitely a place that you can go. You can subscribe. They send you emails about different petitions to sign. Also, follow groups like Black Lives Matter and Movement for Black Lives. Like, diversify your feed in that way. Instead of following so many meme pages, maybe go through and clean out some of that and trade that for some hashtags that mean something that will keep you informed and give you actual action items to take when it comes to certain instances of violence or other incidents. That's definitely something that folks can do. And also, share this podcast.
Share it to 1 or 2, 3 of your friends. Make sure you get the word out, because essentially this is a tool and this is a resource to mobilize change and to get to where we need to be as a society, and essentially providing an equitable change and an equitable opportunity for Black people, specifically in New Mexico.
Yeah.
Because with New Mexico, we deal with a lot of issues, especially being in a minority majority state and being statistically insignificant as Black people. And so all the pressures that we have to deal with in navigating these different systems, like these law enforcement systems, along with just trying to navigate and be heard and be present and visible in a society that is not acknowledging us as a people. We need to, understand these things.
Our very last segment is The Glow, where we'll be highlighting individuals and organizations doing great work in our community.
In this edition of The Glow, we'll be shining light on African American student services for assembling a Green Book for New Mexico. Originally a resource created in 1937, it serves as a guide for Black businesses to be highlighted throughout New Mexico. For more information, you can visit afro.unm.edu. To potentially have your Black business highlighted, you can email afro@unm.edu.
We'd also like to give a special thank you to our post-production partner, Better Sense. Powered by nearly a decade of audio and production experience, Better Sense exists to help you create your life-changing projects. Go to bttrsnc.com in order to explore how you can awaken the potential of your musical ideas. Don't forget to keep up with our podcast and the Office of African American Affairs on the website, which is oaaa.state.nm.us. You can go there and submit any feedback. We'd love to hear from you. And just stay in touch and look out for updates.
For an opportunity to potentially be highlighted on the show, if you go to the podcast page of the website, you can submit your glow and let people know what you've done to empower the Black community. And so again, we continue to ask that you support us, as this is the Black Communities Podcast. This is New Mexico's podcast, and we have to continue to work together to re-educate ourselves in the sense of creating and establishing resources and opportunities to help mobilize the Black community.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for listening. This was Re-Educated, and we'll see you next time.